Hello everybody, welcome to Beyond the Boards, and today we're going to be talking about the action potential of the cardiac myocyte. Now the action potential of cardiac myocyte is a bit different from that action potential that occurs within the skeletal muscles. For one, the duration of the action potential is longer. It's about 15 times longer than that of the skeletal muscles. And this is mainly due to the plateau phase in the myocyte action potential, which is very unique to it, and we'll talk about it in a bit. Also, the cell can be stimulated from impulses from the cardiac conduction system or through the flow of ions from adjacent cells through gap junctions. Now, before we get into the details, I first want to talk about the ion channels that are present within the membrane of the cardiac myocytes and that are responsible for the action potential. And we'll begin by talking about the sodium channels. Now, these sodium channels are called the fast voltage-gated sodium channels. They're called fast because they are very quick to open and they are very quick to close, and hence they remain open for a very brief period of time, about 10,000ths of a second. Now these channels, when they open, they allow the movement of ions from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. And so they allow for sodium influx. And so influx just means the movement of ions towards the cell, to the inside of the cell. And so this direction of flow of sodium ions is because of the high concentration of gradient of sodium ions in the extracellular space relative to that to the inside of the cell. So there's a lower concentration of sodium inside of the cell. And as you know, ions like to flow from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. Now these sodium channels are the first to open in the myocyte action potential and are responsible for phase 0 of the action potential, which is also called the phase of rapid depolarization. We'll talk more about that. Now, as you know, depolarization just means the membrane potential rises and becomes more positive. And in here, it's because positive sodium ions are flowing to the cell and making it more positive. Now, these sodium channels are very similar to those that are found within the skeletal muscles. Now, let's review what I've said so far. These channels are called the fast sodium channels. They're very quick to open, they are very quick to close, and they remain open for a brief period of time. And during that period, a huge amount of sodium ions flow to the inside of the cell, causing the cell to become more positive and hence depolarize. And these channels are responsible for phase 0 of the myocyte action potential, and which we'll talk about more in a second. And these channels are similar to those found with the skeletal muscles. Now, the second type of channels I want to talk about are these calcium channels. Now, these calcium channels are called the slow type calcium channels. They're called or the L-type calcium channels or the calcium-sodium channels. Now, in contrast to sodium channels, these channels are slow. They are slow to open, they are slow to close. And so, and even when they open, when they are told to open, they take a while to open. And so they remain open for a relatively longer period of time, about several tenths of a second. Now, these calcium channels are what's very special about the cardiac myocytes because these channels are responsible for phase 2 of the action potential, which is also known as the plateau phase, which is very unique to the cardiac myocyte action potential. Now, when they open, they allow for calcium to flow from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell, similar to the sodium channels, and it's also due to a concentration gradient. Now, the calcium that flows in not only contributes to the action potential by giving rise to the plateau phase, they also contribute to the contractile machinery of the cardiac myocyte. And so in contrast to skeletal muscles, in which calcium is from the intracellular cytoplasmic reticulum, the myocyte also utilizes calcium from the extracellular fluid as well. And so let's review what I've said. The calcium channels are called the slow calcium channels, the L-type calcium channels, or the calcium-sodium channels. They're slow to open, they're slow to close, and they remain open for a relatively longer period. And when they open, they allow calcium influx, which is not only responsible for phase 2 of the action potential, also called the plateau phase, it also contributes to the contractile machinery of the myocyte. Now, the third type of ion channels I want to talk about are the potassium channels. Now, there are multiple various types of these channels, and unlike the previous channels we talked about, when the potassium channels open, they allow potassium to flow from the inside of the cell to the outside of the cell. So they are responsible for potassium efflux. And recall that efflux just means the ions are moving outside of the cell. And so this is opposite of the sodium and calcium channels, and the reason for that is that potassium ions are mainly intracellular ions, with higher concentration on the inside of the cell and lower concentration outside of the cell. And recall, now when this potassium ions leave the cell, this leads to repolarization of the cell. And recall that repolarization means that the membrane potential becomes more lower, becomes more negative. And because positive potassium ions are leaving the cell becomes less positive. And so to review what I said, there are multiple potassium channels that are responsible for potassium efflux. They're responsible for phase 1 and phase 3 of the myocyte action potential, which we'll talk about. And these phases involve repolarization of the cell. And also there may be some contributions to phase 2, but to a lesser extent. And so the myocyte action potential goes through 5 phases, which are labeled 0 to 4. Now, I have delineated phase 0 right here, and you can see that it is very brief. Now, at this point right here, this is where the cell gets stimulated, and is followed by the immediate opening of those fast sodium channels, which we talked about. And they allow sodium influx, and you can see how this sharply raises the membrane potential. Now, because these channels remain open very briefly, you can see that phase 0 is also very brief. And so phase 0 is just a rapid influx of sodium ions through the fast sodium channels, and this raises the membrane potential from about negative 85 millivolts to positive 20 millivolts because of the influx of positive sodium ions. Now, this phase is very brief, and it begins when the sodium channels open, and it ends when they close. And so phase 0 is then followed by phase 1, which begins when the sodium channels close and then potassium channels open. And this phase is called the initial repolarization, and the cell gets repolarized because the potassium channels open, which allows positive potassium ions to leave the cell, and the cell starts to become more negative. And so phase 1 begins when the sodium channels close, the potassium channels open, leading to efflux of potassium, a loss of positive ions, which lowers the membrane potential, i.e. making it more negative and less positive. And this phase is called the initial repolarization, and it ends when the calcium channels open and phase 2 begins. Now, phase 2 is interesting because it starts when the calcium channels open. However, calcium channels were told to open at this point, at the same time that the sodium channels were told to do so. However, because these calcium channels are slow, they don't open immediately, and that's why these calcium channels open at this point. Now, but once they open at the end of phase 1, 2 things will happen. 1, calcium ions start flowing to the inside of the cell, which are positively charged ions, but also the permeability of potassium ions will decrease, and so that the potassium channels will allow less positively charged potassium ions to leave the cell. And now the reason why this occurs is not fully understood, but nevertheless, this creates a situation in which there is a balance between calcium ions that are entering the cell and the potassium ions that are leaving the cell. And this sort of causes the membrane potential to remain unchanged for a brief period of time. And this is why this is called the plateau phase, because the membrane potential plateaus. Okay, so phase 2 is also called the plateau phase. It begins when the calcium channels open. Also, the potassium permeability decreases, causing this plateau in the membrane potential. This phase ends when the calcium channels close, and this phase is very unique to the myocyte action potential, and is responsible for a more prolonged, sustained contraction. Now, eventually, these calcium channels will close right about here, which marks the end of phase 2 and the beginning of phase 3. Well, with the calcium channels closed, the membrane permeability for potassium is restored, and potassium ions start leaving the cell, causing repolarization, in which the membrane voltage decreases until it reaches the resting membrane potential, which averages about negative 85 millivolts. And that's why this phase is called the phase of rapid repolarization. And so, just to recap, the phase 3 begins with the calcium channels closed, the potassium permeability returns to normal, causing potassium efflux until the membrane voltage reaches the resting membrane potential, which is about negative 85 millivolts. And this phase is called the phase of rapid repolarization. And so phase 4 is just the resting membrane potential, and it ends when a new stimulus reaches the myocyte, causing opening of the sodium channels and entering phase 0 again, and this cycle continues. So phase 4 is just the membrane potential. It's about a negative 85 millivolts, and it ends when a new impulse reaches the myocyte. And so thanks a lot for watching. I hope you've learned something new today. Subscribe to my YouTube channel called Beyond the Boards. I make more content there, and feel free to check it out. Thanks a lot.